Hello, my dears. My name is Louise Miller, but you can call me Grandma Lou just like everyone else does. I'm 73 years old now, and I'm here to share with you a story that has been sitting quietly in my heart for over 60 years. It's a story of loss, heartbreak, and overcoming challenges that no child should ever face. But it's also a story of strength, resilience, and the power of choosing to live and love again despite the pain. I've carried this story with me for most of my life, and for many years I kept it locked away, even from my own children. There are some things that are so painful, so raw, that we push them down deep inside because we think they're too much for others to bear. But today, I'm sharing this story not only for me but for you. If my words can help even one person who's struggling, if my journey can offer a flicker of hope to someone feeling lost in the dark, then it will be worth it. Before I dive into the story, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who have subscribed to the channel. We've just hit 20,000 subscribers. My goodness, that's a lot of people. To thank you, we're going to do a special $200 giveaway at the end of this month. All you have to do to participate is make sure you're subscribed to Grandparents' Tales, hit the notification bell like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It could be Oregon, it could be New Hampshire, it could even be somewhere outside of the US. I want to hear from all of you and I want to get to know you better. Now let's go back in time to 1965. I was just 13 years old, living in the small town of Riverdale, Pennsylvania, a place where everyone knew each other's business. My father, George, worked as a truck driver, making deliveries across the state. He was often away for days, sometimes weeks at a time, leaving my mother, Connie, and us kids behind. My mother worked tirelessly as a seamstress, taking in clothes from the wealthy ladies of the town, washing and ironing their garments. Our house was small but cozy, always filled with the scent of freshly pressed sheets hanging on the clotheslines outside. I was the fourth child in our family, and the only girl, surrounded by three older brothers, Anthony, Joseph, and Robert. My father always said that having a daughter after three boys was a blessing from God. He called me his little princess and always kept candy in his shirt pocket to give me when he came back from his trips. He'd pick me up and carry me in his arms, even though I was already getting big. When he was home, I felt like the most protected person in the world. I felt safe and loved, as if nothing could harm me. But as the months passed, my father's trips became longer, and I began to see less and less of him. His deliveries took him farther and farther away, and he wasn't home as often. I began to feel the emptiness that his absence left behind. My mother, though she was always busy with her work, was still present. But with my father gone so often, I began to notice that something in our family was starting to change. It was during one of these long absences that everything began to unravel. March of 1965. The heat in Pennsylvania was still thick in the air, and my mother had gone to deliver some clothes to a client. I was left at home with my brothers, just like many other days. My mother always told me to take care of the house, and I did, washing the dishes, helping with little chores around the house. I remember it was a quiet afternoon, just me, the dishes, and the soft hum of the house. That's when I felt him behind me. It was Anthony, my oldest brother, and he came closer than he ever had before. He spoke in a voice that was different, one that gave me chills. "Louise, you're becoming a young lady now, you know?" he said, his words strange, uncomfortable. I tried to move away, but he grabbed my arm. My heart began to race as fear crept up on me. "What are you doing, Tony?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Let go of me." Just as I thought things might calm down, Joseph, my second oldest brother, entered the room. I thought he would defend me, perhaps even stop Anthony. But no, his smile told me everything I needed to know. They had planned this. And before I could even process what was happening, Robert, my youngest brother, appeared in the doorway, with a look on his face that I will never forget. It wasn't concern, it was something else entirely. "Mom won't be back until tonight," Joseph said, and I felt my heart sink. What happened in that kitchen that day is something I will never forget. The people who should have been my protectors, my family, became my tormentors. It was the beginning of my personal hell. They took turns. They knew when Mom would be away. They knew every part of her routine, when she would leave the house to deliver clothes or visit neighbors. And they used that knowledge against me. Each time she left, it was like a sentence I had to endure, over and over again. I was too afraid to tell anyone. Robert's words echoed in my head. If you tell anyone, nobody will believe you. They'll say you're a liar. And so I stayed silent. But every day my world grew smaller, and the light that once filled me began to fade. I changed. From a happy, talkative girl, I became a shadow of myself. I stopped eating. I stopped smiling. I started hiding, making myself invisible. I cut my hair short. I wore baggy, unattractive clothes, hoping no one would notice me. But it didn't work. The abuse got worse. It became more frequent, more violent, until I didn't know who I was anymore. I was no longer Louise. I was just someone to be used, someone to be controlled. It wasn't just at home where I struggled. At school, things began to fall apart too. My grades dropped. I missed classes. I couldn't focus. When my teacher asked me what was wrong, I wanted to tell her everything. But Robert's words always stopped me. Nobody will believe you, I would hear in my head. I carried this burden alone. I didn't know where to turn, and every day was a battle to stay alive, to keep my secret hidden. How could I explain what was happening at home? How could I tell anyone about the people who were supposed to protect me but instead became my captors? I didn't know how to ask for help. So I just kept going, hiding behind the walls I had built around myself, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for something to change. But nothing changed. Not until the day everything would come to a head. This is the beginning of my story. A story of pain, of silence, but most importantly of strength. Because despite everything that happened, I am here today. I survived. And I will continue to share my story in the hope that it will bring light to someone who feels trapped in their own darkness. Thank you for listening, and if my words reach you, know that you are not alone. I often find myself thinking back to the simpler days of my childhood, the days before everything changed, before the darkness took hold of my life. I was born in 1952 in a small town called Riverdale, nestled just outside Philadelphia. Riverdale wasn't much. Just a sleepy suburb where everyone knew everyone's business and the pace of life was slow. It was the kind of place where you could leave your front door unlocked without worrying about anything being stolen. Where the biggest drama in town was Mrs. Jenkins' tomato plants not blooming properly. Our home was modest but cozy. It was a small 3-bedroom house on the edge of town, with a big backyard where we spent many of our summer afternoons. My father, George, worked as a truck driver, hauling goods all across Pennsylvania. He was often away for days at a time making deliveries, and there was always a sense of anticipation when we knew he was due to come home. My mother, Connie, worked tirelessly as a seamstress, taking in clothes from the wealthier women in town, hemming pants, mending seams, and even making custom wedding dresses. She worked from dawn until late into the night, but she always had a smile on her face, even when the weight of her work and the responsibilities of the house seemed overwhelming. We didn't have much, but we didn't need much either. There was always food on the table, though it was usually simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables from the garden in the backyard. Mom would prepare meals from whatever she had on hand, often stretching ingredients so that there was enough to go around. She had a knack for making something out of nothing. We didn't have the luxury of fancy vacations or new clothes, but there was something about our family life that made it feel full, rich in love and laughter, even in the hardest of times. I was the 4th child, the only girl in a sea of boys. Anthony was the oldest at 19, Joseph was 17, and Robert was 15. I often found myself caught between their world and my own, trying to find my place in a house full of strong personalities and opinions. Anthony was the natural leader of the pack, always taking charge, while Joseph was quieter, a little more withdrawn. Robert, the youngest, always seemed to be caught in the middle, torn between his older brothers and me. He was the one I played with the most, the one who would share his toys with me when I felt left out. We weren't perfect, but we were family, and that was what mattered most. Growing up, I had a special bond with my father. He was my protector, my hero, the one who made me feel safe when the world seemed big and intimidating. He'd always call me his little princess, and even though I was getting older, he would still carry me in his arms when he came home from his long trips. My father was the kind of man who would bring me candy from his travels, tuck me into bed at night, and promise that no harm would ever come to me as long as he was around. To me, he was invincible, the person who could always be counted on to make everything right again. But life, as it often does, has a way of changing things. As my father's trips grew longer, I began to see less of him. His deliveries took him farther and farther from home, and the time he spent on the road increased. It wasn't that he didn't care for us, it was just the nature of his work. He was always away, and I started to realize that something was missing, something I didn't fully understand at the time. My mother, though she was always there, was busy with her work, and I was left to take on more responsibilities around the house, especially when my brothers were out. I started to feel like I was growing up too fast, taking on more than I should have to. Despite this, our family still had moments of joy. On Sundays, my father would return from his trips, and we'd have a big family meal together. Mom would make cornbread, and Dad would carve the roast, telling stories from the road about the people he met or the funny things that happened on his deliveries. Those meals were sacred times, moments when the world outside seemed to stop, and it was just us, safe and sound under one roof. But as much as I loved those moments, the gaps between them were becoming harder to ignore. My father was home less and less, and when he was gone, the house felt quieter, emptier. The laughter that once filled the air seemed to fade away, replaced by the hum of the washing machine and the constant shuffling of feet in the house as my mother worked, day in and day out. We lived in a small town, and while there was always a sense of community, the world outside was changing too. In 1965, when I was 13, everything changed. My father's absence became more pronounced, and my brothers, who had once been my playmates, started to drift away, each of them focused on their own lives, their own struggles. I was left to pick up the pieces of a family that was slowly starting to unravel. I still remember the first day I felt it, the first day I began to sense that something was wrong. I had always felt protected by my father, but his growing absence left a hole in me that I didn't know how to fill. The changes in our family weren't just physical. They were emotional too. The warmth that once enveloped us seemed to be fading. My brothers were no longer there to protect me or defend me, and it wasn't just their distance from me that bothered me. It was the way the house itself started to feel less like a home, and more like a place where people just existed, going through the motions without truly connecting. That March, when my mother had gone out on one of her errands, and I was left alone at home with my brothers, everything shifted. The things I would later try to forget began to creep in, unnoticed at first but growing steadily, until it became impossible to ignore. The feeling that something had broken, that something was terribly wrong, started to gnaw at me. Looking back now, I understand that it was the beginning of my loss of innocence, the start of a chapter in my life that I would carry with me for many years. I didn't know it then, but the person I was on that day, the little girl full of hope, with her father's promises still ringing in her ears, would soon be gone, replaced by someone who was no longer sure of who she could trust, who she could rely on. But even though it was the beginning of a very dark time in my life, it was also the beginning of something else, something I would never have expected. It was the beginning of the strength that would one day allow me to survive, to rise again, and to eventually find peace in my heart. In a way, it was the beginning of the journey I'm still on even now as I sit here sharing this story with you. The journey of finding hope, even in the darkest of times, and of learning to believe that we can rebuild, no matter what has happened. That's why I'm sharing my story with you today. Not just as a confession of pain, but as a message of hope. If you are watching this and you feel alone, if you feel like your world has fallen apart, I want you to know that you can rise from the ashes. It might take time, it might take patience, but you can rebuild. You can find the strength inside you that you never thought was there. So, if you're listening to my story, know that I'm here for you, just as I hope my story can offer something to help you move forward. Thank you for being here with me, and let's continue this journey together. It was strange, how quickly things can change in life. One moment, everything feels familiar and safe, and the next, you find yourself questioning what you thought you knew. That was the spring of 1965, when everything began to shift in my world. I was 13 years old, and the warmth of my father's presence, the sound of his laughter echoing through the house, started to fade. The house didn't feel like home anymore, and the people I should have trusted the most, my family, became the very source of my pain. Up until that point, I had always been a cheerful, talkative girl. I loved to play outside with the neighborhood kids, sneak bites of Mom's cornbread when it was still warm, and help my dad wash the truck when he came back from his long trips. I had always felt safe. My father, George, was my protector, my hero, and my mother, Connie, was the pillar of our household. Even when life was hard, they made sure we were loved, cared for, and fed. My brothers, despite being older and often distant, had always been part of my safety net. But that safety net began to unravel one afternoon in March 1965. The day had started out like any other. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, birds chirped outside, and I was washing dishes, listening to the hum of the house as my mother had gone out to deliver some clothes for the local ladies. I was alone with my brothers, and at that age I never thought twice about being left with them. But on that day something shifted. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but I knew something wasn't right. It started with Anthony, the oldest of my 3 brothers. At 19 he should have been mature enough to look out for me, to protect me, but that day he came too close. His voice was different, too soft, almost too calculated. "Louise, you're becoming a young lady, you know?" he said with a look that made my stomach churn. My body froze. I took a step back, confused, trying to brush off the feeling that something was wrong. Before I could react, Joseph, my 17-year-old brother, entered the kitchen. He didn't seem concerned, didn't seem like he would defend me as I had expected. Instead, there was a strange smile on his face, and that's when I realized the two of them had planned something. The air felt heavy. Robert, my 15-year-old brother, appeared in the doorway, watching quietly. "Mom won't be back until tonight," Joseph said, his voice calm, like this was just another ordinary afternoon. But I could feel the unease growing in me. Something was wrong. I don't need to explain what happened next in too much detail. Suffice it to say, that afternoon marked the end of my innocence. The people who were supposed to protect me, to love me, became the ones who hurt me the most. My brothers, the ones I had laughed with, played with, and trusted, betrayed me in the worst possible way. They left me there, lying on the kitchen floor, broken and confused, with Robert's haunting words echoing in my mind. "If you tell anyone, nobody will believe you. They'll say you wanted it." I stayed frozen in that moment, unable to move, unable to think clearly. When I finally gathered the strength to get up, I went straight to the bathroom, turned on the shower, and scrubbed my skin until it was red, hoping that somehow the water could wash away what had just happened. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to act normal when Mom came home, but my eyes, swollen from crying, gave me away. I told her I had a headache, that everything was fine, even though my world had just collapsed. In the days that followed, I learned to hide my pain. I locked my bedroom door, pushed the dresser against it, hoping it would keep them out. But it didn't. It never worked. Every time my mother went out, every time my father was away on one of his long trips, they found a way to get to me. They knew when to strike. They knew my mother's schedule better than she did. They took turns, and it felt like I was trapped in my own home. There was nowhere to hide. I began to shrink into myself. The girl who used to sing in the kitchen while doing the dishes, the girl who would run outside to catch fireflies in the summer, disappeared. I stopped smiling. I stopped laughing. I stopped being me. My world became a shadow of what it used to be. At school, things weren't any better. My grades, which had once been excellent, began to fall. I missed classes, stayed home more often, and when I did show up, I found it harder and harder to concentrate. My teachers noticed, and one day Mrs. Adams, my favorite English teacher, pulled me aside. "Louise, what's going on? You've always been such a diligent student. You're not yourself," she said with concern. I wanted so badly to tell her the truth, to pour out everything that had been happening at home, to ask for help. But the words wouldn't come. Robert's threat echoed in my mind. "Nobody will believe you." And so I kept quiet. I couldn't let anyone know. I couldn't even believe it myself. At home, I began dressing differently, loose, ugly clothes that would hide my body. I cut my hair short, stopped smiling, and tried to make myself invisible. I didn't want to be seen, didn't want anyone to notice me. But it didn't matter. They still came for me. They always found a way. The abuse became a regular part of my life. I started to bleed outside of my menstrual cycle, felt pains that made me faint, and had fever that came and went without explanation. But I couldn't tell anyone. How could I? Robert's words haunted me, and the fear of losing my family, of destroying everything, kept me silent. And so I continued to suffer in silence, pretending that everything was fine. I told myself that once my father came home, everything would go back to normal. But deep down I knew it wouldn't. My life as I knew it had already changed forever. The first signs of trouble were subtle at first. The unease, the small, chilling moments, the gradual shift in my brother's behavior. All of it happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. But once that door was opened, once I realized the truth about what was happening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The facade of a happy family, of a safe home, was gone. This was only the beginning of my journey through darkness, but little did I know at the time, it was also the beginning of my strength. I didn't know it then, but I was learning the lessons of survival, of holding on in the face of unbearable pain. It would take years before I could truly understand what happened to me, before I could begin to heal. But this was the moment when I realized that the people I loved the most could also be the ones who hurt me the most. And this was the moment when I learned that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about finding the strength to keep going, to rise above the things that tried to break me. The first signs of trouble in my life were like cracks in the foundation of a house. Small at first, barely noticeable. But as time went on, those cracks grew, and so did the weight of the burden I carried. My story wasn't just one of loss and betrayal. It was also one of resilience, and eventually, of overcoming the impossible. But before I could overcome it, I had to survive it. Betrayal is a word that can feel heavy, like a stone in your chest, one that grows larger with every memory of broken trust. I never imagined the people closest to me, those who should have protected me, would become the ones to hurt me. The worst part of it all was that I never saw it coming. In the beginning, it was subtle. Small moments, strange interactions, things I couldn't fully understand at my young age. But over time, the truth became undeniable. The people who should have been my protectors, my family, became the ones who made my world feel unsafe, cruel, and broken. At 13, I was still a child, navigating the early years of adolescence with curiosity, joy, and a sense of innocence. I didn't know what it meant to feel betrayed by those I loved, to have the people closest to me betray the sacred bond of trust. That was until my brothers, the very ones I had grown up with, the ones I shared laughter, play, and secrets with, turned into the monsters I feared most. It wasn't like in the movies where the bad guys are obvious with dark cloaks and menacing looks. No, this was different. This was insidious. It crept into our home slowly, like a shadow that stretched across every corner, unnoticed at first, but eventually covering everything in darkness. I remember the first time Anthony, my oldest brother, spoke to me in a way that made my skin crawl. He was 19, just a few years older than me, but at that age, those few years made a world of difference. He pulled me aside one afternoon while I was washing dishes. His voice was different, and his eyes, those eyes that I used to trust, had a look I couldn't quite place. He told me in a low voice that I was becoming a young lady. At 13, I didn't fully understand what that meant. But his tone, his proximity made me uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a passing comment, something I could ignore. But then came Joseph and Robert too. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes, and in that moment, something deep inside me told me that I wasn't just being oversensitive. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I wish I could say I fought back, that I screamed and ran away, that I stood up for myself in that moment. But I didn't. I couldn't. They were my brothers, the people who were supposed to protect me, guide me, love me, and here they were violating everything that should have been sacred. I couldn't even find the words to explain how they made me feel. Instead, I was paralyzed by a mixture of fear, confusion, and shame. I thought maybe it was my fault, that I had somehow invited this. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I had been too naive to see the danger lurking in my own home. What followed in the coming weeks was nothing short of hell. They didn't stop. The abuse became regular, a pattern they could control. They knew when my mother would be out of the house, when my father would be away, and that's when they took advantage. They knew my mother's routine better than she did, when she would go to deliver clothes to the wealthy families in town, or when she would chat with the neighbors for hours in the afternoons. And during these times I was left alone, vulnerable. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the emotional and psychological toll that really broke me. They manipulated me into believing that it was my fault, that I was to blame for what was happening. They told me nobody would believe me if I told. That if I ever spoke up, I'd be labeled a liar. That I was worthless. These words, these cruel accusations, dug into my heart and twisted like a knife. I started believing them. I began questioning myself, doubting my worth, and most painfully, I started to believe that I deserved the abuse. I tried to fight back, tried to push them away, but they were stronger. Anthony, Joseph, and Robert knew how to play on my vulnerabilities, how to break me down without leaving a visible mark. They used manipulation, threats, and intimidation, twisting my sense of reality until I couldn't trust myself anymore. The worst part was that I couldn't tell anyone. How could I? How could I tell my mother, the woman who worked so hard to keep our family afloat, that her sons were the ones hurting me? She wouldn't believe me. She couldn't. At least that's what I told myself. It wasn't until one night, after a particularly brutal attack by all three of my brothers, that my body simply couldn't take it anymore. I started bleeding heavily. It wasn't a normal period, it was something far worse. The pain was so intense that I passed out in the bathroom. When I came to, I was surrounded by blood, with no strength left to even scream for help. My brothers found me, and instead of offering help, they panicked. They cleaned me up, changed my clothes, and tried to cover up what had happened. They were afraid. Afraid that if anyone found out, their lives would be ruined. They would go to jail. The fear in their eyes was real, but it wasn't fear for me. It was fear for themselves. They weren't afraid of what they'd done to me, but what would happen to them if the truth came out. But despite their efforts to keep me silent, something happened that night. My father, who had been away on one of his long trips, came home early. He was supposed to be gone for another day, but he finished his work ahead of schedule and arrived that night, just when I needed him the most. I remember him coming into my room, the light flooding in as he touched my hand, waking me from the darkness. His voice trembled when he saw the blood-soaked sheets. "Louise, daughter, wake up," he whispered, shaking me gently. "What happened here?" And that was when I spoke my first words of truth since it all began. "Dad, help me." The chaos that followed is a blur in my memory, but I remember my father's reaction in vivid detail. His calm, steady presence, the one that had always made me feel safe, shattered. I saw him lose control, his anger erupting in a way I had never seen before. He was furious, devastated, and helpless all at once. It wasn't just the blood. It was the betrayal. His three sons, the very children he had raised, had done this to his daughter. At the hospital, the truth came pouring out, not just for me but for everyone. The doctors confirmed what had happened. The abuse had been ongoing, a pattern that had stretched on for months. I had been subjected to repeated violence by my own brothers. The diagnosis was clear: internal trauma that was severe enough to threaten my reproductive organs. It felt like a death sentence in many ways. My body had been violated, and the emotional toll was far beyond what anyone could have prepared me for. The social worker who came to talk to me after the doctor stabilized me was kind, but there was no way to sugarcoat what had happened. I tried to tell her the truth, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I lied. I told her that it had been a group of men I didn't know, men who had attacked me on the way home from school. The lie slipped out without me even realizing it. It wasn't that I didn't know the truth, I did. But the idea of destroying my family, of making my father lose his sons, was unbearable. So I chose silence, even though it felt like acid burning away at my insides. The betrayal was not just physical. It was emotional, psychological, and it carried a weight that no child should ever have to carry. My brothers, the ones I trusted, the ones I should have been able to lean on, turned against me in the most brutal way. They took away my innocence, my sense of safety, and my trust in the people I loved most. But I learned something through all of this: betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story. I could have let the pain, the betrayal, and the shame define me, but instead it was the beginning of my fight to reclaim my life. The truth came out, and with it the power to heal. The journey was long, painful, and fraught with struggle, but it taught me something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The greatest betrayal comes from those closest to you, but the greatest strength comes from finding a way to rise above it. There are moments in life when silence becomes a weapon, an invisible barrier we create around ourselves to shield us from the truth. At first, this silence seems like protection, like a way to keep the pieces of our lives from shattering. But over time, silence can become suffocating. The lies we tell to protect others, to protect ourselves, often have a cost that isn't paid in currency but in pieces of our own soul. I learned that at a very young age, and the truth of it still echoes in my mind today. After that night in the hospital, after the truth of what had happened to me began to seep out in broken fragments, I found myself caught in a web of silence and lies. My father, my hero, was shattered. the man who had once been the rock of our family, the one I had always turned to for comfort and safety, had his world torn apart in the blink of an eye. His sons, his flesh and blood, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. And my mother, the woman who had spent her life working hard to raise us, was now caught between the truth she had always known and the lie she had to believe in order to survive. At first, my father didn't know what to believe. The chaos in the house after my hospitalization was something I could never fully describe. It was like living in the eye of a storm. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and the hum of daily life, now felt like a cold, desolate place. My father tried to make sense of what had happened. He was angry, furious even. But there was a part of him that couldn't comprehend how his own sons could have done such a thing. He spent hours questioning me, trying to make sense of the impossible. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him the whole truth. The fear of destroying my family, of ripping apart the very fabric of our lives, kept me silent. And yet, the more I remained silent, the more I could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on me. I remember the days following my return home from the hospital, days filled with my father's attempts to protect me, his desperate need to fix everything. He cleaned and decorated my room, trying to create a new, fresh start for me. "A fresh start, princess," he said, as he handed me the key to a newly locked door. "No one enters here without your permission. No one." It was his way of trying to take control of a situation that was spiraling out of control. But the truth was, the damage had already been done. The violence was in our home, living under the same roof as us, and nothing could change that. In those early days, my brothers stayed away, avoiding the house, avoiding me, avoiding my father. It was as if they had become ghosts, unable to look me in the eye. Joseph, the middle child, tried to pretend nothing had happened. He would return late at night, go straight to his room, and avoid speaking to anyone. Anthony, on the other hand, began to play the role of the concerned older brother. He would come to me, asking if I was okay, offering to help with things around the house. It was all a lie. A game he played, trying to act as if he hadn't been a part of the nightmare I was living. He would even try to talk to me about my grades, or if I wanted to watch television like nothing had happened. But I could see through it all, the fake concern, the false kindness. His words, his actions were calculated, a way to maintain control over the situation. And Robert, the youngest, the one who seemed the most affected by everything, he too changed. He would stare at me from a distance, his eyes full of remorse, full of fear. He seemed to age years in the short time after that night, his face hollowed out by guilt. I could see it in his eyes. He was terrified of the truth coming out, terrified of the consequences, of the world knowing what they had done. And yet, despite his obvious remorse, I couldn't bring myself to forgive him. He was just as guilty as the others, even if he claimed to have been coerced. The truth was, he could have stopped it. He could have said no. But he didn't. The hardest part of it all was not just the violence, the betrayal, but the silence that followed. For months, we never spoke about what happened. It was like an unspoken rule. Don't talk about it, don't confront it. As if ignoring it would somehow make it go away. My mother, the one who had raised me with love and care, was caught in a trap of her own. She tried to protect me in the only way she knew how, by pretending everything was okay. She would cook my favorite meals, comb my hair like she had when I was little, trying to recreate the normalcy we once had. But I could see the cracks in her facade. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the helplessness, the way she would avoid looking at me directly, as if afraid I would see the truth in her own soul. And there, in the middle of all the lies, I was caught. I was forced to protect them, to protect my family. I lied to the police, told them a story that wasn't true, because I didn't want to destroy everything. I didn't want my father to lose his sons. I didn't want to shatter the family even further. The lie I told, that it had been a group of strangers, that they were from out of town, was the first of many lies I would tell over the next few months. Each one dug a deeper hole inside of me. Each one made me feel more isolated, more alone. But I thought I had no choice. The weight of protecting my family felt too heavy to bear. And I believed that silence was the only way to keep it all together. But silence, as I would come to learn, is never the answer. The longer I stayed silent, the more I realized that I was only hurting myself. The shame, the guilt, the fear, all of it was eating away at me. I began to shrink away from the world around me. I stopped trusting people, stopped believing in the goodness of others. The whispers at school, the pity in my classmates' eyes, the way I was treated differently, made me feel like a ghost. I no longer recognized the girl I used to be. My relationship with my mother deteriorated too. She began to question me, question my behavior. She didn't understand why I had changed so much. Why I wasn't the same girl she had raised. She didn't understand that it wasn't just a phase, that it was the weight of the lies, the silence, the trauma, that was keeping me from moving forward. She didn't know how to help me, how to reach me, because I wouldn't let her. I wouldn't let anyone in. There was a point, though, when the lies became too much to carry. My father's suspicions grew. His protective instincts were sharper than I gave him credit for. He knew something wasn't right, and he started asking questions. But the fear, the terror held me back from telling him the truth. How could I? How could I destroy our family? How could I hurt my father, the man who had always been my protector? I wasn't sure how long I could keep the silence up, how much longer I could lie to him, to myself. But I knew one thing for sure. The longer I remained silent, the more the darkness would consume me. It wasn't until the truth finally came to light that everything began to unravel. The silence had kept me trapped for far too long, but it also brought me to the brink of understanding. In the end, it wasn't just about breaking the silence. It was about learning that sometimes, the truth is the only way to heal. The lies we tell to protect others are often the ones that destroy us from the inside out. There's a moment in every story, a single turning point, where everything changes. It could be a look, a word, a gesture, or a sudden realization that sweeps in like a storm and shifts the course of everything that came before it. For me, that moment arrived when the truth, the one I had been trying to protect with every ounce of my being, finally spilled out into the open. It wasn't easy. It wasn't planned. But when it happened, it was impossible to ignore. And as painful as it was also the beginning of my journey toward healing. I had spent months living in silence, holding on to the lies I had told the police, my mother, even myself. The lie that had been so carefully crafted, to protect my family, to protect the reputation of the ones I loved. But with each passing day, the weight of that lie became harder to carry. I had been drowning in it, trying to stay afloat while pretending that everything was normal. My father, the strong man who had always been my protector, had no idea what was really happening in our house. I knew he was suspicious, but I also knew that if I told him the truth, it would shatter everything. It would destroy him, my mother, and the family we had once been. The more I tried to suppress the truth, the more it gnawed at me. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even think straight. It was as if my mind was split into two parts, one that screamed for justice, for the truth to be known, and another that begged me to protect the family at all costs. I had been lying to myself for so long that I had started to believe my own lies. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough to keep pretending. Eventually, the dam was going to break. It all came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon in June 1966. My father had been gone for most of the day, working with the police to track down the attackers I had described, who I now knew were my brothers. My mother had been in the backyard hanging clothes, and I had been sitting in the living room, trying to focus on a math lesson that my mind just couldn't grasp. The house, once a place of laughter and comfort, had become a place of tension, of fear, of quiet whispers. The air felt thick, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then out of nowhere, Anthony walked into the room. He didn't knock or say anything. He just appeared, sitting down next to me on the couch like it was any other day. But I could feel the difference. The air was charged, heavy with something I couldn't quite name, and my heart began to race. My body tensed as he spoke, his voice cold, calm, too calm. "We need to talk, Louise," he said. His eyes locked onto mine, his tone deceptively gentle. "This situation can't continue like this." I froze, every instinct in my body telling me to run, to hide, to get away from him as fast as possible. But instead, I stayed where I was, my legs rooted to the spot, my breath shallow. I stood up quickly, trying to make an escape, but his grip on my arm was swift, firm. "Calm down," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. But you need to understand something." His grip tightened. "Dad's getting suspicious. Yesterday he asked Robert a bunch of questions, and the kid almost spilled everything." The words hit me like a punch. My father had always been my protector. I had always believed that no matter what, he would be there for me. But now I had to face the terrifying reality that he was starting to suspect the truth. If that happens, the whole family goes down the drain, Anthony continued, his voice low, almost pleading but with an edge of menace. Is that what you want? I looked at him, at his face that used to be my brother's, but now it was something else entirely. His eyes weren't the eyes of a sibling anymore. They were the eyes of a man who had turned into a monster. I felt a surge of courage rise up in me, something I hadn't felt in months. Let go of my arm now, I said, my voice trembling but firm. Never touch me again. Anthony seemed taken aback by my response. For a moment I thought he might back off. But then his face hardened and he stood up, towering over me. You don't understand, do you? He said, his words sharp with anger. If you tell the truth, Dad will kill us. Literally. Do you want that on your conscience? You didn't think about my life when you did what you did. Tears streamed down my face as I looked into his eyes. Why should I think about yours now? I asked, my voice breaking. You've destroyed my life. You stole my childhood. The tension in the room escalated as I stood there, my heart pounding. And then, as if on cue, the living room door flew open with a crash. My father stood there, holding a folder of documents. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with shock and fear. For the first time in months, I saw something in him that I had never seen before: rage, fury, but also an overwhelming sense of pain. Get away from my daughter, he commanded, his voice trembling but steady, filled with an authority I hadn't heard from him in years. The way he spoke to Anthony, commanding him to move away, shook me to my core. My father had always been the gentle protector, but now he was a force of nature, and for the first time I was afraid. He threw the folder onto the table, the papers scattering across the floor. As he spoke, his voice low and controlled, I could see the devastation in his eyes. I just got back from the hospital, he said. I went to get copies of Louise's exams. I wanted to send them to a specialist in Philadelphia. He picked up one of the papers from the floor and held it out, his hand shaking slightly. Do you know what it says here, Anthony? He continued, his voice cold. It says these injuries are consistent with repeated abuse over a long period of time. It wasn't just a single attack. It was months. The room seemed to close in around me. My father turned to me, his face full of anguish. Why did you lie, daughter? He asked, his voice breaking. Why did you protect them? Why didn't you tell me? For a long moment I couldn't speak. The truth had been building inside me for so long, but now that it was out, it felt like a weight too heavy to bear. I looked at my father, at the man who had always been my hero, and finally, I whispered the words that had been suffocating me. It was them, Dad, I said softly. It was my brothers. The moment I spoke those words, I knew that everything had changed. My father's face went ashen. He closed his eyes, as if the weight of my words had physically struck him. How long? He asked, his voice trembling. How long has this been going on? I could only whisper, since March. When you made that long trip to Ohio. 3 months. My father murmured to himself, the realization settling like a cold, hard truth. My God. 3 months. What happened next felt like an explosion in slow motion. My father, who had always been calm and collected, was no longer the man I had known. He advanced on Anthony with a roar of fury, lifting him by the collar and throwing him to the ground. My mother screamed in the background, trying to intervene, but it was too late. The truth had been revealed, and nothing could undo the devastation it had caused. The neighbors, drawn to the commotion, rushed over to find my father restrained by 3 men, Anthony bleeding on the floor and Joseph standing there, his face pale with a broken nose. The scene that had unfolded in our living room was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. My father, who had always been my protector, was now a man broken by the horror of what his sons had done. It was in that moment, as the police arrived, that I felt the full weight of what had been hidden for so long. The truth had come out, and with it, the destruction of the family I had once known. But even in the midst of the pain, I knew that this was the beginning of something else, the beginning of healing, of facing the truth no matter how painful it was, and of finding a way to move forward. In the weeks that followed, as my brothers were arrested and the case went to trial, I knew that my life had changed forever. But for the first time I felt a glimmer of hope. The The truth had been spoken, and in that moment it felt like a small victory. The moment the truth had spilled from my lips, there was no going back. My father's protective instincts, once calm and steady, had shifted into something darker, more desperate. My mother, devastated by the truth, seemed like a ghost of the woman I had known. And I was numb. But at least the silence was gone. What followed was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, and for the first time in my life, a sense of justice stirring in me. It was in those first few hours after the truth came out that the police arrived, an essential part of what would begin the long, arduous road to justice. It all started with the arrival of the officers, one of whom I recognized. Officer Martinez had worked in our town for as long as I could remember. He was tall, always had a calm, steady voice, and treated everyone with respect, no matter who they were. His presence brought me a sense of security I hadn't realized I was missing until that moment. He wasn't just doing his job, it felt like he was there for me, for us too. He walked in, his face a mixture of disbelief and concern, but he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He knew the gravity of the situation. In a way, he had known something was off long before this moment. But like me, he had been trapped in a web of silence and denial. "George," Officer Martinez said to my father, his voice kind but firm, "I need to take a statement from your daughter." My father, still shaking from the rage that had been building in him, looked at Officer Martinez and then at me. I could see the torn expression on his face. He wanted to protect me from everything, including this. But deep down, I knew this was the only way forward. This was how I would start reclaiming my life. This was how we would finally begin to heal. "I know it's not easy, Louise," Officer Martinez continued, turning to me now, "but we need to hear your side. The more we know, the better we can help you and ensure something like this doesn't happen again." My mother, still in shock, barely spoke. She had always been the emotional one, the one who saw good in everyone, even when it hurt her. Now she was just a shell of herself, staring into the void, unable to process the horror that had unfolded within our own home. It was almost as if she had aged 10 years in a single day. I took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest, but I knew I had to face it. I owed it to myself. I owed it to the girl I used to be before everything fell apart. And as much as I wanted to look away, as much as I wanted to pretend this was all just a bad dream, I couldn't. Not anymore. The first few questions were the hardest. Officer Martinez asked me where I had been that afternoon, what had happened in the kitchen. I answered mechanically, every word feeling like it weighed a ton. I didn't have to look at him to know he was piecing everything together. The way I spoke, the trembling in my voice, the way my eyes would dart away from his as if trying to avoid the memories. He had seen this before. "Could you tell me exactly who was there, Louise?" he asked gently. I swallowed hard. "It was Anthony, Joseph, Robert," I said, my voice breaking with each name. It felt like I was betraying them, but I knew in my heart I wasn't. I wasn't the one who had done wrong. I wasn't the one who had stolen my innocence. They were my brothers. My family. I never thought they'd do something like this. I didn't want to believe it. The silence that followed my words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, but other than that, it was as if the world had stopped spinning. I glanced over at my father, who was sitting by the door, his face crumpled with regret. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His grief and anger were etched in every line of his face. The fact that the truth had come out didn't change the fact that his sons, his flesh and blood, had betrayed him. He had failed to protect me. I had failed to protect myself. Officer Martinez nodded, taking notes as he processed the information. He didn't rush me. He didn't push me to say more than I could handle. And for that I was grateful. His calmness was a stark contrast to the storm inside me. "Do you know what they've done, Louise?" he asked softly. "Do you know how serious this is?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yes, I know." My father let out a shaky breath as if hearing those words made it even more real. It felt like a dream, and yet it was more real than anything I had ever experienced. I wanted to scream, to wake up and find myself back in that simple, innocent world where I could still trust those around me. But that world was gone, and the police were here to ensure the monsters who had taken it from me would face justice. The officers moved on to other questions, asking for specifics, details, and descriptions of what happened after that afternoon. They asked me about the abuse, the regularity of it when it started, and how it escalated. Each word felt like I was peeling off another layer of my soul, exposing more than I ever wanted to. But it was necessary. Every painful word spoken, every detail relayed, brought us closer to finding the truth, to holding them accountable for what they had done. As the questioning continued, I noticed something in Officer Martinez's face. An understanding, perhaps, that this wasn't just about the abuse anymore. This was about survival. This was about making sure no one else went through what I had gone through. Making sure that no other girl would feel the isolation and shame that had been planted deep inside me. At one point, a second officer arrived, a younger woman named Officer Garcia, who would help gather the evidence. She was kind, and while I couldn't bring myself to speak with her as I had with Officer Martinez, I felt her presence was a small, comforting reminder that I wasn't completely alone. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Officer Martinez said as I finished my statement. "We'll make sure they don't hurt anyone else. And we'll be with you every step of the way." He left soon after, promising to check back in the next few days. But even as they left, I knew things would never be the same again. The police had done their part, but this was just the beginning. The road ahead was going to be long, filled with trials, court hearings, and painful confrontations. I wasn't sure I was ready for it, but I knew that I didn't have a choice. Looking back now, I can see that the involvement of the police was a turning point. Their professionalism, their empathy, and their determination to make sure I was heard marked the first real step toward reclaiming my life. They gave me the courage to speak, even when the truth was the hardest thing I had ever said aloud. For the first time in what felt like forever, I began to believe that justice was possible, that what had been done to me wouldn't be swept under the rug. And even though I didn't know how much more I could endure, I knew this was the beginning of the fight to reclaim my life. After the truth came out, the immediate aftermath was nothing short of devastating. For weeks I had lived in a house of silence, each day a struggle to survive the unseen, unspoken terror that had been growing within my family. But now the storm was here. My brothers had been taken away, their lives forever altered, and my father, the man who had always been my protector, had been shattered by the revelation. And as for my mother, well, she was a woman caught between love and devastation, trying to come to terms with what her sons had done and the deep betrayal that had turned her world upside down. The first few days after the police had left felt like walking through a haze. I was physically exhausted, my body drained from the trauma, but emotionally I was barely hanging on. My father was a shell of the man he used to be. He had always been my hero, strong, protective, and calm, but now he was broken. Every time I looked at him, I could see the pain in his eyes, the deep guilt that gnawed at him. It wasn't just the fact that he had failed to protect me. It was that he had failed to protect his own sons too. The man who had always kept us safe from harm was now unable to even look me in the eye without falling apart. My father's guilt was palpable. He would spend hours pacing in the living room, muttering to himself, asking over and over again how he could have missed it. Why didn't he see the signs? Why didn't he come home sooner? Why didn't he notice the changes in me, the way I had become a shadow of my former self? He was consumed by the thought that if he had only been more present, perhaps he could have stopped it before it ever started. The weight of this guilt ate at him like a slow poison, and I could see that it was eating him from the inside out. I remember one night, my father sitting at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he gripped his mug. I had been avoiding him for days, too ashamed of everything that had happened to face him. But on this particular night, I couldn't avoid him any longer. He looked at me with such pain in his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have protected you, Louise. I should have been here. I wasn't here when you needed me the most, and now look at what's happened." I could see the tears welling up in his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I let my guard down. I reached across the table, placed my hand on his and said, "It wasn't your fault, Dad. You didn't know. No one knew." But that didn't stop the guilt from suffocating him. The hardest part was watching him retreat into himself, his usual strong, steady demeanor replaced by a man who was questioning everything he had ever done. It was as if his entire identity had been shattered in the face of this unimaginable betrayal. His quiet despair seemed to seep into every corner of the house, And no matter how much I tried to reassure him, nothing seemed to make a difference. Then there was my mother. I had always thought of her as the emotional center of our family, always there with open arms, always able to comfort us with her quiet strength. But after the truth came out, I watched as she too began to fall apart. I could see her battling with her own emotions, caught between love for her sons and the overwhelming disgust and sorrow she felt for what they had done. The mother in her wanted to protect them, to believe that they could be redeemed, but the woman who had seen the destruction they caused couldn't ignore the ugly truth. Her heart had been torn into pieces, and I don't think she ever truly recovered. For weeks she barely left her room. She would cry silently, her body shaking with grief. I could hear her sobbing through the walls, and it broke my heart. She wasn't just mourning the loss of her sons, the loss of the family we had once been. She was mourning the loss of her own sense of self. How could she have missed the signs? How could she have failed as a mother? I tried to comfort her, but the more I tried, the more distant she became. It was as if she was trapped in a never-ending cycle of guilt and grief, unable to escape the weight of what had happened. The once vibrant woman who had always been my rock was now a shadow, too consumed by her own shame to offer me the support I so desperately needed. At school, the situation was no better. The whispers followed me everywhere I went. "That's the girl," they would say when I walked down the hallway. "The one whose brothers did that awful thing." Some kids looked at me with pity, others with morbid curiosity, but none of them knew how to look at me without seeing what I had been through. To them I was no longer Louise. I was a symbol of something dark and twisted, and I could feel the judgment in every stare. I spent most of my time alone, sitting under a tree at recess, trying to block out the noise of their whispers. I had always been a good student, but my grades began to slip. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't focus on anything except the storm of emotions raging inside me. At night, the nightmares would return. Flashbacks of the pain, the betrayal, the darkness that had consumed my home. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, gasping for air, only to find myself in the safety of my bed, still haunted by the images in my mind. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that wanted to protect my family, especially my mother. I didn't want her to bear the full weight of the truth. I didn't want her to have to face the fact that her sons were the ones who had done this to me. I wanted to shield her from the shame and the guilt she was already carrying, even though I knew deep down that it wasn't my responsibility to protect her. But my silence only made things worse. I watched as my mother's grief began to consume her. I saw her age before my eyes, the weight of the past months leaving its mark on her. The woman who had once been so strong, so full of life, was now fragile, broken. And there was nothing I could do to fix it. The guilt that my family felt was something I could never escape. It wasn't just the guilt of my father or my mother. It was the guilt that I carried within myself. I felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, for not telling someone what had happened when it started. I felt guilty for letting it go on for so long, for not being brave enough to tell the truth. But the hardest guilt I felt was the guilt of knowing that my brothers, my flesh and blood, had done something so horrific, and there was nothing I could do to undo it. It's easy to think that guilt and shame are just emotions, something you can push aside or ignore. But they aren't. They seep into every part of your life, like a poison that spreads through your veins. It eats away at your sense of self-worth, at your belief that you are deserving of love, of kindness, of peace. And when it comes from your own family, the people you should be able to trust the most, it cuts deeper than anything else. As I look back now, I realize that guilt and shame are the chains that keep us from moving forward. But they're also the things that keep us bound to the past. We can't truly heal until we let go of those chains, until we accept that the things that happen to us are not our fault, and that we are worthy of peace, of happiness, and of love. For my family, the guilt would never fully go away. My father and mother would continue to wrestle with their own demons for the rest of their lives. But I would find a way to forgive them, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved to let go of the anger, the pain, and the weight that I had been carrying for so long. The guilt may always be there, lurking in the shadows, but I refused to let it define me. I refused to let it be the thing that ruled my life. In the end, forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant setting myself free. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The decision to leave Riverdale wasn't an easy one. After everything that had happened, After the secrets and the betrayal that had festered within the walls of our old home, it seemed like we had no choice but to start over. But even though I could never forget what had occurred, the promise of a fresh start in a new town brought with it a mixture of hope and fear. We were escaping the past, but the shadows of it still clung to me, refusing to let go. When my father first brought up the idea of leaving, I didn't know what to think. Riverdale had been all I had ever known. It was a small town where everyone knew your name, and in our case they knew our story too. Everyone was talking about us. The family torn apart by secrets too dark to speak of. The whispers followed me in the hallways at school. The pitying looks from the neighbors. The judgment that weighed heavy on every corner we walked. My father, the man who had always been my hero, was now just as broken as the rest of us. I could see the toll it had taken on him, on all of us. The streets of Riverdale no longer felt like home. I remember that night in early June when my father sat us down to talk about moving to New Hope. He told us that he had requested a transfer to a new office, one where he wouldn't have to go on long trips anymore, and we'd be able to settle into a new life. A life far from the hurt and the memories that haunted us. New Hope was about 250 miles away, and it was nothing like Riverdale. It was a small, quiet town nestled by the Delaware River, surrounded by hills and historic buildings. It seemed like the perfect place to escape to, with its gentle fogs that covered the streets on cold mornings and its peaceful, slower pace of life. We would be starting over, leaving behind the house we had lived in, the furniture that had witnessed so much pain, and most importantly, the memories that were suffocating us. I wasn't sure if I was ready to leave. How could I leave everything I knew behind? My friends, my school, my old life. All of it felt like a distant dream. I hadn't even begun to process what had happened, and now I was being asked to pretend as if none of it ever existed. I had grown so accustomed to the fear, the shame, the isolation, that the thought of starting fresh felt almost impossible. Would I ever be able to fit in somewhere new? Would I ever be able to heal? Or was this just another attempt to bury what had happened without confronting it? But then, looking at my father, I saw the exhaustion in his eyes. I saw the weight of the years he had spent feeling helpless, the years he had spent blaming himself for everything. He wasn't just trying to escape the memories of what happened, he was trying to protect me, to protect all of us. I could see that this was his way of trying to rebuild our family, to give us a chance at a new beginning. It was the one thing he could do to make it right, to start over in a place where nobody knew our pain. "I know it's hard," my father said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "But we need to move on, Louise. We need to build a future. A better one. I know you're scared, but we'll be okay. We'll stick together, and we'll heal." I wasn't sure if we would ever heal, but I nodded anyway. For him. For my mother, who had barely been able to function since everything had come out. For all the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering how she missed the signs. I could see her starting to pull herself out of her depression, but it was slow. And moving to New Hope, where we could be just another family trying to make a life for ourselves, was something we all needed. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of packing, sorting, and preparing. I watched as my father meticulously cleaned the house, fixing things that had been broken for years. He painted over the old, chipped walls and removed the worn-out furniture that had witnessed so much. My mother decorated the small apartment we would be moving into in New Hope with cheerful flowers and colorful curtains, hoping to make it feel like home. We tried our best to focus on the future, to embrace the new life that was waiting for us, but I could still feel the weight of the past clinging to me. When we finally arrived in New Hope, it felt like stepping into a different world. The streets were lined with historic homes and charming little shops, and the air was fresh, crisp, and clean. The town felt alive in a way that Riverdale hadn't for a long time. There was something hopeful about it, something that whispered of new beginnings. It was as if the fog that covered the town was also trying to shield us from our pain, to give us the space we needed to breathe again. The first few days were surreal. My father had already started his new job in the transportation company's office, and he was home every night, something that hadn't happened in years. My mother found a small job at a bakery near our new apartment, making pastries and spending her days with the ladies who came in to chat. It wasn't much, but it kept her busy and helped her start to heal. It felt like we were slowly coming back to life, even though the wounds from the past were still fresh. I was enrolled in St. Mary's Academy, a small Catholic school not far from our apartment. I remember walking into that first day of school, the nervousness settling in my stomach like a stone. Nobody knew me here. Nobody knew what I had been through. To everyone else, I was just the new girl, quiet, a little sad, but just another teenager adjusting to the new town. First, I didn't speak much. I kept to myself, hiding behind the walls I had built around me to protect myself from being hurt again. But there was something different about this place. The people were kind, and the nuns, though strict, were gentle in their own way. Slowly, I started to open up just a little. I didn't tell them everything, of course, but I began to trust again, one small step at a time. We may have moved to New Hope physically, but emotionally, I was still trapped in the past. The scars were invisible, but they were there, lingering beneath the surface. The nightmares didn't go away just because I was in a new place. In fact, they became more intense at first. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, unable to escape the memories of what had happened. But my father, despite his own pain, was always there for me. He would sit with me, his hand on mine, whispering that everything would be okay, that nothing bad would happen to me again. In the first few months, New Hope felt like a protective bubble, a place where I could start to heal. But even in the safety of this new life, I knew I couldn't outrun the past. It was still a part of me, a part of my story. The real challenge was going to be learning how to live with it and move forward, no matter how difficult it seemed. Looking back, I can see now that moving to New Hope was the first step in my journey of healing. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the past, but it gave me the space to breathe, to rebuild, and to begin to understand that I could choose my own path. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but I had my family by my side, and for the first time in years, I began to believe that there was a future worth living for. The first steps toward healing were small and, at times, painful. We had moved to New Hope, hoping to leave the past behind, but it didn't take long for me to realize that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And journeys, especially those of healing, don't follow a straight line. They have twists, turns, detours, and setbacks. At times, I felt like I was making progress, only to be pulled back by an unexpected memory or nightmare. But as I sat here today reflecting on that long road, I can honestly say it was worth it. In the early days of our new life, I struggled to find a place where I could feel safe again. Safe in my own mind, safe in my own body. I had tried to outrun the memories by moving, but I quickly learned that running from the past only works for so long. The truth is, no matter where you go, the past follows you. It lives within you, in your memories, in your body, and in the very way you carry yourself. You can't escape it, but you can learn to live with it. You can learn to build a life that's not defined by the pain you've been through. It was my father who first taught me that lesson. His own journey of healing was just as slow and painful as mine, perhaps even more so. He was the one who had always been my protector, my hero, and now he was the one who needed protection. I saw him fall apart in ways I had never imagined. The man who had once been strong, who had carried the weight of our family with such grace, was now just as fragile as the rest of us. But through it all, he remained by my side, offering a steady hand when I felt like I was drowning in my own thoughts. "We'll get through this, princess," he'd say, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We'll get through it together." And that's exactly what we did. Together. In New Hope, we were able to start fresh, but we also had to face the painful reality that nothing would ever be the same. The scars were still there, both visible and invisible, and they would be with us forever. But that didn't mean we couldn't heal. In the first few months after moving, I spent a lot of time alone. At school, I was the quiet new girl. I tried my best to blend in, to not draw attention to myself, but I couldn't escape the way I felt inside. I was angry, confused, and most of all deeply ashamed. I didn't know how to talk about what had happened. How could I? No one at school could ever understand. The idea of opening up to anyone seemed impossible. But then there was Teresa. She was a classmate from St. Mary's Academy, and she was the first person to reach out to me without judgment, without prying into my past. "You're always so quiet, Louise," she said one day during recess. "You need to go out more, enjoy life a little." It wasn't an intrusive comment. It wasn't filled with pity or questions. It was simply an invitation to connect, to step out of my shell, even if only a little. Her kindness was the first step I took toward rebuilding. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I began to talk to her more. Slowly, I allowed myself to share bits and pieces of my story. Not the whole truth, but enough for her to understand that I had been through something difficult. "It must have been horrible," she said, her voice filled with empathy, but she didn't press for more. That was what I needed, space to share on my terms. Over time I made more connections. Some girls at school became friendly with me, though none of them were truly close. I didn't want close friendships, I wasn't ready for that. But their kindness, their willingness to let me be myself, helped me to regain something I thought I had lost forever. The ability to feel normal again. At home things started to settle too. My parents tried their best to return to a semblance of normalcy. My mother, still recovering from the shock of everything, decorated our new apartment with flowers, colorful curtains, and little trinkets to make it feel like home. My father, ever the protector, worked tirelessly to provide for us, though his heart was heavy with guilt. He had his own struggles, his own pain to contend with, but through it all he continued to show up for me, every single day. He was still the same man who had carried me in his arms when I was little. He just didn't know how to fix the brokenness he saw in me now. My father's presence was a constant source of strength. There were days when the weight of everything seemed unbearable, but then he would sit beside me at the kitchen table, his weathered hand resting on mine. "You're going to be okay, princess," he would say, the words reassuring, but I could hear the sadness beneath them. "We're going to get through this." I wanted to believe him, but there were times when I felt like I was drowning. I'd have nightmares that seemed to tear me apart, visions of what had happened to me that I could never escape. I tried to push them away, to ignore them, but they kept coming, flooding my mind like a relentless tide. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't feel anything but the raw emptiness inside me. In those moments, my father would sit by my bed, holding my hand until I calmed down. I know he didn't have the answers. He couldn't take away my pain, but his presence, his steady, unwavering love, gave me the strength to keep going, even when I didn't want to. It was also in these moments that I realized something important. Healing doesn't happen overnight. It's a process and it takes time. I had to learn to be patient with myself, to allow myself to grieve, to feel, and to heal at my own pace. There were days when I wanted to scream at the world, days when I felt like everything was falling apart. But there were also days when I took small steps forward, when I began to feel like I was reclaiming my life, bit by bit. As time went on, the nightmares became less frequent, but they never completely went away. Sometimes I'd still wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, unable to breathe. But it was during these moments that I learned the importance of asking for help. I began to open up to my parents more, to share my fears, my pain, and my hopes for the future. Slowly, the walls I had built around myself started to crumble. One of the most important lessons I learned during this journey was the power of forgiveness. Not just for others, but for myself. I had spent so many years blaming myself for what happened, thinking I could have done something to stop it. But as I started to heal, I realized that it wasn't my fault. I had done nothing wrong. The pain I carried wasn't mine to bear alone. It was the result of the betrayal and the abuse I had suffered, and I needed to let go of the guilt I carried for so long. Healing is not about forgetting. It's not about pretending that the past didn't happen. It's about finding a way to live with it, to integrate it into your story without letting it define who you are. I still carry the scars of my past, but they don't define me. They're a part of me, yes, but they don't control my life anymore. In the months that followed, I continued to rebuild. I went to therapy, learned to confront my fears, and slowly started to trust again. I was never going to be the person I was before, it was impossible to go back to that. But I was learning to be someone new, someone stronger, someone who had overcome unimaginable pain and was ready to build a future. As I reflect on that time, I realized that it wasn't just the support of my parents that helped me heal. It was the love of those around me, the people who cared enough to listen, to be there for me, and to offer their support without judgment. It was the understanding and kindness of friends like Teresa that showed me that I didn't have to carry this burden alone. And most importantly, it was the love of my father, who never gave up on me, who reminded me every day that I was worth fighting for. In the end, the journey of healing is one we all must walk alone. But it doesn't mean we have to do it without the support of others. The road may be long, and the pain may never fully go away, but there is always hope. And as I sit here today, I can honestly say that I am grateful for the journey, for the lessons I've learned, for the strength I've discovered within myself, and for the life I have built, despite everything that happened along the way. It's often said that the act of writing can be a powerful tool for healing. For me, that statement became a reality at a point in my life, when I was desperately trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Writing became my way of confronting the past, not as a victim, but as someone who was finally ready to take control of my own story. In many ways, the words I put down on paper were not just a release but a declaration. I was no longer going to let my past define me. Instead, I would find a way to make peace with it, to understand it, and ultimately to rebuild my life from the broken pieces it had left behind. I had carried the weight of what happened to me for years, never allowing myself to fully confront it. The guilt, the shame, the anger. It all stayed locked inside me, swirling around like a storm I couldn't escape. When I was younger, I didn't know how to express these feelings, so I kept them hidden. I didn't know that by keeping them inside, I was only hurting myself more. But as I grew older, I realized something important. In order to move forward, I needed to face what had happened, to let it out, and to confront it head-on. That's when I began writing. First, it wasn't easy. The words felt clumsy and inadequate, and I often found myself stuck, unable to put the right words on paper. How could I describe what had been done to me? How could I explain the pain, the betrayal, the confusion? I had no experience with expressing such deep emotions. Writing seemed like a daunting task, but I knew I had to try. I had to let it all out. I started with short journal entries, writing about my day, my feelings, the things that were weighing on my mind. Slowly, as I got more comfortable, I began to dig deeper into my past. I wrote about the day everything changed, about the abuse, about my brothers, about the guilt I carried. At first, it felt like I was unearthing something that had been buried for far too long, and the process was painful. But as I wrote, I began to understand more about myself and the trauma I had experienced. I started to see the connections between the abuse, my silence, and the person I had become. It was through writing that I was finally able to understand the power of my own voice. I had spent so many years silencing myself, pretending that everything was okay, convincing myself that I didn't have the right to speak up. But writing gave me a safe space to express myself, without fear of judgment, without the need to explain myself to anyone. It was just me and the page. No one could tell me what to say, how to say it, or when to stop. One of the most powerful things I wrote was a letter to my brothers. I had carried the anger, the hurt, and the betrayal for so long, but I hadn't allowed myself to voice it. The letter was not just an opportunity to express my feelings. It was a way of reclaiming my power. By writing it, I was taking control of the narrative. I wasn't going to let them dictate my story any longer. I wanted them to know the truth, not just for them but for me. In the letter, I told them exactly how I felt, how deeply hurt I was by their actions, how much trust had been broken, and how the scars they left on me would never completely heal. But I also told them that I no longer hated them. That was the hardest part, admitting that I didn't hate them. I didn't forgive them either, but I realized that carrying that hatred was like carrying a heavy burden that I didn't need to bear anymore. The pain was still there, but by releasing the anger, I was able to make space for something else, peace. Writing that letter to my brothers was one of the hardest things I ever did. It felt like I was reopening old wounds, but at the same time I knew it was necessary. I needed to confront them, to let them know how their actions had impacted me, and to finally speak the truth. It was not an act of forgiveness but rather one of acceptance. Accepting that what had happened was a part of my past, but it didn't have to control my future. After writing the letter, I didn't send it right away. I sat with it for weeks, reading it over and over, making small changes here and there. But every time I read it, I felt more and more empowered. Eventually, I knew that I had to send it. It wasn't for them, it was for me. It was my way of setting myself free. When I sent the letter, it was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't expecting any response, but I felt that I had finally done what I needed to do. I had faced my past, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my voice. I had acknowledged the pain, the trauma, and the betrayal, but I had also taken the first step toward healing. Writing didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the past or the scars that would always be there. But it gave me a sense of control, a way to take ownership of my story. It gave me the freedom to express my feelings without fear, and it helped me understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting. Healing means accepting what happened and finding a way to live with it, to make peace with it. Over the years, I continued to write. I kept journals, wrote letters to friends, and even started working on a memoir. Each time I wrote, I learned something new about myself. I learned that I was stronger than I had realized, that I had the capacity to forgive, not for the sake of others but for my own peace of mind. I also learned that healing is not linear. Some days are better than others, but the important thing is to keep going, to keep writing, to keep healing. Writing gave me the space to process my emotions and to take ownership of my story. It helped me confront the past and move forward, not by erasing it, but by finding a way to live with it. It allowed me to heal in a way that was deep, real, and lasting. If you're watching this and you're struggling with your own pain, I encourage you to try writing. You don't have to share it with anyone. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just let the words flow. You may be surprised at what you find when you confront your past and give yourself the space to heal. Writing gave me the courage to live my truth, and I believe it can help you do the same. In life, there comes a time when you must choose between staying stuck in the shadows of your past or stepping into the light of your future. For me, that moment came after years of pain, fear, and regret. It wasn't easy, and I can't say I've fully healed from everything that happened to me, but I can say this: I chose peace. I chose to move forward not because I had forgotten, but because I had finally learned to live with my scars, to transform them into symbols of strength, not shame. I remember the first time I truly felt that a new beginning was possible. It was a quiet afternoon, just a few months after I moved to New Hope, when I found myself sitting alone on the porch of our little apartment, watching the world go by. It wasn't much. A few simple flowers in pots, the sound of children playing in the distance, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery my mother worked at. But in that moment it felt like a fresh start. A new chapter was unfolding, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The transition from Riverdale to New Hope had been difficult, of course. We had left behind not only the physical memories of our old life, the house, the furniture, the photographs, but also the heavy weight of our past. New Hope felt like a world apart from the chaos and darkness of Riverdale. The town was small, quiet, and distant from the painful whispers that had once followed me. It offered a sense of safety, a chance to breathe, to start over. But despite the new environment, I knew that my healing had to begin from within. No matter how far we moved, the real work was internal. And that work began with allowing myself to feel the pain. For years I had shoved my emotions deep down, convincing myself that I could push through. But you can't outrun pain forever. You can't ignore your past and expect it to stay buried. For so long I had allowed my history to define me, those years of abuse, the guilt, the shame. But when I moved to New Hope, I realized that if I wanted to truly move forward, I had to face those feelings head-on. I had to grieve. Grief isn't just about mourning a loss. It's about recognizing that something important was taken from you, something that can never be fully replaced. For me, that loss was my childhood, my innocence, my trust. But grief, as painful as it is, can also be a path to peace. It forces you to confront the deepest parts of yourself and come to terms with what has happened. It doesn't change the past, but it makes room for healing. One of the first steps I took toward healing was reconnecting with the things that had once brought me joy, things that had been buried under the weight of my trauma. I started drawing again. I had always loved art as a child, but somewhere along the way I had abandoned it. Maybe I didn't feel worthy of beauty anymore. Or maybe I thought it was just another way to escape. But in New Hope, I allowed myself to pick up a pencil again. I would sit by the river on sunny afternoons, sketching the landscape, the way the light danced on the water. Slowly, I began to realize that my art wasn't just a distraction. It was a way of processing everything I had been through. It was my way of expressing the emotions I had kept locked inside. Through art, I rediscovered my voice. Not the voice I had once used to protect myself, to keep the truth hidden, but a new voice. A voice that was free to express joy, sadness, hope, and fear. And that voice, I realized, was part of who I was meant to be. Another part of my healing journey was rebuilding my relationship with my parents. Moving to New Hope had provided us with a chance to start fresh, but it wasn't easy to undo the damage that had been done. My parents were struggling too, each in their own way. My mother, once the strong pillar of our family, had collapsed under the weight of guilt and grief. She spent months in bed, unable to find joy in anything. My father, on the other hand, threw himself into his work, trying to fix everything with his hands, but never truly confronting the emotional devastation that had taken root inside him. It wasn't until we sat down together and had an honest conversation that I realized how important it was for us to heal as a family. For so long we had avoided talking about what had happened, each of us carrying our pain in silence, afraid to reopen the wounds. But silence only deepens the wounds. So one evening after dinner, I gathered the courage to speak. I told my parents how I was feeling, how the past still haunted me, how the memories of Riverdale wouldn't let me go. To my surprise, my mother didn't shy away from my words. She listened, and then she shared her own pain. She talked about her own guilt, how she had blamed herself for not seeing the signs, for not protecting me better. It was the first time in years that we had spoken so openly, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from all of us. We began to cry together, not just for what had happened, but for what we had lost and for what we were finally able to gain, the chance to heal as a family. I also started seeing a counselor in New Hope. I had resisted therapy at first, thinking it would be another useless attempt to fix something that could never be fixed. But, over time, I came to understand the value of having a safe space to talk about my feelings, to work through my trauma with a professional who could help guide me. It wasn't a quick fix. Healing never is. But with each session I began to see myself not as a victim, but as a survivor. A woman who could still create a future despite her past. In the summer of 1968, I took another significant step forward. I graduated from high school. It felt like a huge accomplishment, a symbol of how far I had come. For the first time in years, I was excited about the future. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to build a life for myself, to find peace and happiness despite everything that had happened. I also found strength in my friendships. The girls at St. Mary's Academy had initially treated me with curiosity, unsure of how to approach me. But over time they saw me for who I truly was. Not the quiet, broken girl from Riverdale, but Louise Miller, a young woman with dreams and ambitions. One friend, Martha, became particularly close. She was the first person I really trusted with a piece of my past. And when I shared my story with her, she didn't flinch or treat me with pity. She just listened. And for the first time I felt accepted, not for what had happened to me, but for who I was becoming. That acceptance, both from myself and from others, was the key to my healing. I began to realize that peace wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. It wasn't a destination. It was a process, a journey. It was about taking small steps every day, choosing to let go of the anger, the fear, and the shame. It was about allowing myself to live without being defined by my past. As I sit here today reflecting on everything I've been through, I see how far I've come. I see the woman I am now. Someone who is at peace with her past, who has learned to love herself despite the scars, and who has chosen to live a life filled with joy, love, and purpose. And I hope that by sharing my story with you, I can inspire others to choose the same, to find peace, to forgive themselves, and to begin the journey toward healing. Life is never easy, but the power to change it is within us all. Peace doesn't come from avoiding the pain, but from facing it and choosing to move forward, one step at a time. And no matter where you are in your journey, remember that you are not alone. You have the strength to overcome. You have the power to rebuild your life just as I did.